Now, great lives, and once you hear who this week's guest and subject are, you'd be right to expect some trouble ahead.
Trotsky. The very name triggers images of a dangerous ideologue gone way beyond the pale. Some might think of him as the good pig Snowball in George Orwell's Animal Farm, but Winston Churchill called him an ogre of international subversion. Which perhaps explains why our subject was forced into exile so many times. I tried counting. Siberia in 1902, and then an exile for life following an attempt at revolution in 1905. In 1914, he was forced to flee his new home in Vienna. Then in 1916, he was deported from France to Spain and thence to the United States. In 1929, he was exiled again from the new Union of Soviet Socialist Republics which he had helped create, and died in Mexico from the wounds from an ice pick in his skull. After such a breathlessly exciting opening, it seems foolish to ask my guest, Christopher Hitchens, why he's chosen Leon Trotsky. But what is it about him that makes him your great life?
I should be honest and say when I was first asked to do this programme, I was asked to nominate anyone I liked. And I thought, well, I could choose someone furry, like the author you just mentioned, Mr. Orwell, about whom I've written a book. But I thought that would be cheating slightly. I should pick someone who people very often misunderstand, and who still has the power to inspire love and hatred, the two necessary sources of energy.
So, beyond a challenge on a radio programme, you do genuinely admire him?
I always have, yes. I don't pick him just for his revolutionary career, remarkable though that was. I chose him as a man of action who was also a man of ideas, an intellectual. And as an excellent member of my profession, journalism, he was a tremendous foreign and war correspondent, wrote exemplary stuff, particularly from the Balkan Wars, which is still very readable. And perhaps also as the exemplar of the non-fatalist Jew, of the Jew who won't be pushed around, who fights back, and also demonstrates military genius. Quite an amazing life, in other words.
I better explain to our listeners a little bit about you, Christopher, who from a standing start, despite being born in Portsmouth, have successfully mutated into one of the most successful yet divisive figures in American media land. Christopher's recent departure from the left caused quite a fuss, but it's less clear where he's departed to. It's now rather hard to pin him down on the ideological spectrum. He'll write one week about the stupidity of Ronald Reagan, the next about the lies of Michael Moore. Column titles, by the way, not necessarily my opinions. And despite his books, his obvious learning and his acclaimed writing for publications such as Vanity Fair, he's probably best known in Britain for attacks on Mother Teresa, George Galloway and the Queen Mother. We've a Trotsky expert to help us too, but before turning to him, let's hear a short clip of Trotsky himself talking here in 1937 to the Mexican people and thanking the president for offering yet another place of exile. It's not a perfect recording, but if you listen closely, you might just make out the sound of some noisy Mexican roosters in the background. Maybe those cocks crowed 3 times, for it was here that he was to die.
Esteemed audience, you will easily understand if I begin my short address to you in my very imperfect English by addressing my warm thanks to the Mexican people and to the man who leads them with such merit and courage, President Cardenas. When monstrous and absurd accusations were hurled at my and my family, the Mexican government opened the doors of his magnificent country and said to us, here you can freely defend your rights and your honor.
Chris, have you heard his voice before?
No, never. And it's a little higher in pitch than I would have imagined. I would have certainly imagined a more throaty person. But he also sounds as if he's learned English from someone who's French.
He sounds like Hercule Poirot, doesn't he?
Yes, he does a little bit. It's a touch of the Poirot.
I mean, you've got none of the oratorical swoop there at all.
I had better introduce you to our listeners.
I'm sorry,
They don't know who you are yet. Robert Service is Professor of Russian History at St Antony's College in Oxford. He's already written biographies of Lenin and Stalin, and he plans one on Trotsky. And you have heard his voice before, Robert.
Yes, I have. And I think in that instance, he was being very restrained. As Christopher is saying, he was speaking in a foreign language that he spoke imperfectly. The man was an orator of genius, had the full range of tones. He was the great orator of the Russian Revolution.
Because of those student posters, I always think of him as a hunched and bookish little fellow with funny round glasses. What sort of a physical appearance did he in fact present?
He was taller than most Russians. He was a very fine-looking man. Some of the original photographs are equivalent to those of a matinee idol. He was very vain with it and went to the best photographers, to the best suit makers.
He cared a lot.
Nothing's too good for the working class, we used to say.
Yeah.
When did you fall in love with this man, Christopher?
When I was first drawn to the revolutionary left in the mid-60s, I was lucky to run into...
How old were you then?
I was born in 1949.
Oh, so was I.
But you weren't lucky enough to be born in Portsmouth.
I wasn't lucky enough to be drawn to Trotsky.
No. In the passion that we felt about defending the people of Vietnam from the criminal assault being made on their country, I sort of shopped around the left a bit, and I found a group that was then called the International Socialists that would more likely have called itself a Luxembourgist group, if you appreciate these fine distinctions, but that would now say as post-Trotskyist, but as admiring the tradition of the left opposition to Stalin, that is to say. So I thought this group seemed to have a theoretical grasp that was appealing.
But did you fall for the ideological position of the group, or was it the man himself, Trotsky?
Well, one is supposed as a Marxist not to be a hero worshipper or a leader follower. In a way, the whole project of Marxism is to undo that attachment, to make people less reliant on it, teach them to think and act for themselves. But yes, as it happens, humanity is so made that we look for charisma, or we know it when we see it. I'd have to say I found Rosa Luxemburg and Leon Trotsky to be extremely charismatic.
But Bob Service, charismatic maybe, but he doesn't actually sound to me a very nice man. He sounds selfish and egotistical. Was he?
I think he was very egotistical as well as charismatic. And the problem with the man is that he did have, in his period of power, an absolute commitment to the use of state terror that really is quite appalling. But because he was so charismatic, because he wrote so well, some of his literary reviews, some of his wartime dispatches, as Christopher's been saying, from the Balkans before the First World War, really stand rereading now. And that tends to coat what we think about Trotsky, because he seems to be a much more human, attractive personality. But I think Trotsky is an appalling figure.
Where did he start? Did he come from a proletarian family?
No, he came from a family of Jews who'd moved from the north to the south of Russia, where they would get less persecution from the authorities. And his father, although he couldn't read or write, was an absolutely brilliant farmer. And he took over the land of the effete nobles in the region. He built windmills. He set up really a model farming system. He was an absolutely exceptional human being too, like his son, Leon.
Leon? But was he called Leon?
No, he was called Lev.
And what was his surname?
His surname was Bronstein.
And, Chris, why did he change it?
He had to do a quick change of name at a iffy police frontier post. And into his head flashed the name of, I think, a warder in a jail he'd been in. And he said Trotsky, and they just wrote it down. And he decided to stick with it. Well, he got stuck with it and then did stick with it. But it would have been Lev Davidovich Bronstein.
That wouldn't have worked, would it? Lev Bronstein, a bit like Bob Zimmerman, doesn't have the appeal of Leon Trotsky or
Adolf
Bob Dylan.
Schigel-Gruber, yes.
Yes.
I know. Or
Marketing.
the first title of Catch-22, which was Catch-18.
Yes. Do you think there was a bit of personal marketing going on?
The Leon, I think, would be that's simply de-Judaizing it somewhat.
Was that a problem for him?
He was a very non-believing, very secular, very internationalist Jew.
Yeah.
If you mean, was Jewishness a problem?
Yes.
Well, it was a problem for every Jew under Tsarism, because there was official anti-Semitism. It's to the Tsarist regime that we owe the Protocols of the Orders of Zion, the famous fabrication.
Yeah.
Take us, Bob, in a few brisk sentences from school, where he was rebellious and brilliant, through the 1905 uprising to the 1917 revolution.
He was a real talent. And like a lot of people of that generation, of the 1890s, he turned to revolution. as he went out into the little circles of Marxists, he always dominated them. He picked up his first wife in one of these circles and then dumped her in pretty shabby circumstances. Was arrested in 1898, put into exile in 1900, escapes dramatically from exile in Siberia and makes his way to London, goes back to Russia to help with the revolution of 1905, is arrested again, goes on trial. It's a big, almost a show trial. He escapes again, 1907, goes into Central Europe, and there he stays, mainly as a writer, not as a man of action.
There was a moment in early August 1914 when the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, who had just made a huge demand on Serbia that he knew would lead to war, was talking to a friend who said, "Are you sure you want to push this to a war? Because if it comes to a war with Russia, it might involve Britain and France and so on. It might end up not with a victory for any one side, but with a revolution." And the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister replied, "Revolution, yeah, who's going to start a revolution? That Mr. Trotsky in the Café Central?" There. In fact, Trotsky himself made a very interesting observation that you could at that time get all the revolutionaries in Europe into 2 stagecoaches.
Take us...
Sorry, would you mind? On this point about dictatorship and ruthlessness and so on, I would enter the following plea. We ought to allow ourselves, without being counterfactual, or merely hypothetical, I think, to imagine what might have happened if the 1905 revolution had been a success, which was what Trotsky and Lenin most ardently hoped for and worked for. It was a not bad revolution against a really appalling despotism. Had it succeeded, I think one might have forestalled the First World War, and the political change in Russia and everywhere else could have proceeded without the ghastly consequences of the imperialist carnage, which is not the fault of the left. It wasn't they who reduced Europe to rubble and bloodshed, and who organized the White Armies, which were the precursors of fascism, who had to be very ruthlessly dealt with by the leader of the Red Army. This is, I think, a mistake to judge his methods as if they were the product of a cruel personality rather than the outcome, at least in large part, of a very, very degraded historical conjuncture.
I think, though he lacked the personal sadism of Stalin, he had a clinical doctrinarism which lasted more or less to the end of his life. Just a few months before he died, he wondered whether, in fact, the whole cause for which he lived his life, the proletarian revolution, might have been an unfulfillable quest. And he just pondered about whether his whole political life might prove to have been futile. And then, of course, the ice pick got him.
Well, don't you think that rather speaks well of him?
I think that does speak well of him, but I think the problem is this, that the ideas of the Russian Marxists were not shared by the overwhelming majority of the people of the Russian Empire. In those circumstances, you either step down from power or you repress.
Can I just read this? It comes from rather later in his life. After, as head of the Red Army, he'd been responsible for the execution of large numbers of soldiers who showed cowardice or desertion in the field. This shows you, A, what a wonderful writer he was, B, what a clinical logician he was, and C, I think, what a cold man he must have been. An army, he wrote, cannot be built without reprisals. Masses of men cannot be led to death unless the army command has the death penalty in its arsenal. So long as these malicious, tailless apes that are so proud of their technical achievements, the animals that we call men, will build armies and wage wars, the command will always be obliged to place the soldiers between the possible death in the front and the inevitable one in the rear. That's a chilling.
I don't think so at all. I think it's a commonsensical remark. It's actually, if you had, it sounded, if I'd closed my eyes, it sounds almost exactly like what Abraham Lincoln said about what the regrettable necessities of being president and commander-in-chief were, and the number of death warrants he had to sign.
Chris, do you think that human beings are malicious, tailless apes?
Yes, I think I've always thought so. One has only to look around. That we are the products of a very imperfectly evolved mammalian species is self-evident to me.
Everybody says the revolution would have failed without him. Why do they say that?
I don't say that. I think that's Trotsky speaking, Trotsky writing, Trotsky having an influence on decades of historical writing, including those writers who are themselves anti-communist. He had such a spirited way of writing and such a clear-cut way of writing off Stalin that he's ready-made for everyone who is willing to think lazily about the consequences of the October 1917 revolution.
Well, I only know what I've read by non-partisans of his as well as partisans who've described the events, and whether it's John Reed or Bertrand Russell or Arthur Ransom or any of the others who were there at the time, he seemed to have been the one who called attention. But I think he himself would have said that without Vladimir Ilyich, Ulyanov, known as Lenin, nothing would have happened. He would have given the palm to Lenin.
His critics, Bob, light next on the Kronstadt rebellion. What is there to criticise there? What happened?
Well, one of the great sources of support for the Bolshevik Party, apart from the urban working class, was the naval garrison of Kronstadt, lying just off the coast of what was then Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. Those soldiers had backed the Bolshevik Party, had even pushed the Bolshevik Party into seizing power. They mutinied nearly 4 years later against the Bolshevik Party because they were appalled by the absence of political pluralism, cultural tolerance. And Trotsky, as head of the Red Army, was the mastermind behind the suppression of those sailors. And the poor devils were sent off to a camp, a labour camp in the far Russian north, never heard of again. He was embarrassed about this when he wrote his history. There are only a couple of fleeting references to the Kronstadt mutiny in his autobiography. And he got his son, very late in life, to research the history of the Kronstadt mutiny. It obviously irked him. There was this human side to him that we've been talking about, but also it politically embarrassed him. It was constantly brought up against him. You took power in the name of the workers, the peasants, the soldiers and the sailors, and you bloodily suppressed them whenever they spoke out against you.
Did you know about this, Chris, when as a young man?
Oh, yes, we would, believe me. I mean, many's the evening I've spent discussing the Kronstadt question. And there is a pamphlet, at the very end of his life, he was still involved in arguments with American Trotskyists about this, and ex-Trotskyists, who wrote one of his great polemics, it's called Their Morals and Ours, saying, that he thought there was a Pharisaic element in some of these criticisms, but also showing that, yes, he had a bad conscience about it. I wanted just to say that, while I talk about those American Trotskyists, those men went on to become many of them, what we now call the neoconservative movement. People who evolved out of left opposition Marxism into a sort of American social democracy, anti-totalitarian, very anti-Stalinist. One of his lasting influences to this day starts with that Kronstadt argument. And there is an expression on the left, especially on that part of the left, for when you broke with the party, what it was that impelled you. And the word for it is, what was your Kronstadt? And Daniel Bell, the great Daniel Bell, still alive, professor of politics at Harvard, boasts that Kronstadt was his Kronstadt. He's old enough to have broken with Marxism over the Kronstadt case itself.
You're listening to Great Lives with me, Matthew Parris, my guest, Christopher Hitchens, and our expert, Robert Service. Before we move on to Trotsky's eventual exile from the newly formed Soviet Union, just want you to listen to this.
Hello, good evening everybody. This is Moscow calling. You are listening to Radio Center Moscow and have just heard the International. Workers of all lands, unite.
We moved on a few years to 1936, by which time, extraordinarily, the entire Soviet state seems to be at war with Trotsky. Before asking why, let's just hear the radio station's account of one of the first great trials into Trotsky's reputation.
The trial of the counter-revolutionary Trotsky wrecking group in the Kemerovo mines is over. The proletarian court has passed its severe and only possible sentence. Death to the enemies of the people.
Professor Service, what went wrong for Trotsky, the great hero of the October Revolution?
He wanted a different USSR from the one that Stalin was aspiring to. He saw that if he didn't somehow persuade the party to spread the revolution to Europe, there would always be a state of siege. And at the time he said this, most Bolsheviks wanted a period of retrenchment, in the 1920s, and that gave Stalin, a much more manipulative politician, the chance to pounce on Trotsky and get rid of him, deport him from the country in 1929.
The 1936 snippet that we just heard marks, I think, the most glorious part of his history, which also demonstrates an extraordinary political acuity. He understood very early on that German fascism, National Socialism, was not just another form of reactionary politics, that it was something completely new and extremely dangerous. The line of Stalin's supporters in Germany at the time was, it's no big deal, it's just another form of conservatism. When it's blown itself out, it'll be our turn. After Hitler, us was actually their slogan. They died for their stupidity. He said, no, this is completely different. Sink your differences with the Social Democrats. It's the most extraordinary set of essays that he wrote, appealing to the German and international workers' movement to realize that this was a threat of a new type. Not only that, he realized that the British government was going to cave into it, and he wrote a fantastic critique of the Munich Agreement, saying that Neville Chamberlain would have given up all the hopes of democracy in Eastern and Central Europe for 10 years more rule in India, and that by making this deal with Hitler, he'd opened the way for Hitler to make a deal with Stalin. He said, this will be the inevitable outcome. His voice at that period is uncanny to read. It still makes the hair on my back stick up. Tailless ape that I am. It's remarkable. It's a Cassandra.
Yes, one could put it differently. One could say that ever since the Second World War, the left have been seriously embarrassed by the early collusion between Nazism and the new Soviet Union.
Not as embarrassed as they should be, in my opinion.
Yes, and that Trotsky is the one person who is at least free of that stain.
I think the problem with that view, though, is that it doesn't balance it with what he thought about the Soviet Union. If you read Trotsky's works about what kind of state is emerging in the Soviet Union as the rival on the left to Hitler on the right, then it's a picture of a bureaucracy. But you don't get any impression at all of the millions of people who died during collectivization. And of course, because he didn't know much about what was going on in the Soviet Union by the late 1930s, you get no impression of the sheer scale of the purges and the vengeful dynamism of the man who had got rid of him, Stalin. He never really took the measure of Stalin and Stalinism.
Well, since you've been introduced as the expert, and quite rightly, as I must concede, which I suppose means I'm the amateur, I say this with great trepidation, but if you look up the Bulletin of the Opposition, the BO as the comrades called it, in the 30s, you'll see extraordinary accounts of how many, up to include how many millions of horses have had to be shot or be starved to death in the Soviet Union. Very informed reports from sympathizers within.
And is it your
passed to a world that was paying no attention?
Is it your view,
and the opposition was saying?
Is it the view of Trotskyites that had Trotsky been in...
Trotskyists, by the
way. Is it your view, and is it the view of Trotskyists, that had Trotsky himself been at the helm instead of Stalin, it would all have been very different?
Well, again, to be a Trotskyist, let's say, or to be a Marxist, which I would rather say, isn't to be a votary of an individual, and it's certainly not. It's certainly designed to replace the Carlyle theory of history.
This is a rather evasive answer.
No,
Christopher. Would Trotsky have been?
The problem is, would if the program of the left opposition had been adopted earlier? It's quite possible, in the view of some people, that many of the horrors of collectivization.
Oh, come on, Christopher! You've chosen Trotsky as your great life.
It's not a matter of saying having Trotsky instead of Stalin. That wouldn't be.
You can't say. You can't give me yes to my question.
No, not because I don't accept the grammar of your question.
Well, Stalin, I think, was in charge. Trotsky might have been in charge. Would he have been very different?
I'll have to repeat this to you. It's a matter of the program of the left opposition, which was a large faction of the party, which was generally thought to be led by Trotsky, had been adopted. That's how one has to argue.
But look, the problems for the Bolsheviks were going to be the same, whoever was in power. They all agreed about much more than they disagreed about. They all agreed on the one-party state. They all agreed about dictatorship. They all agreed about society as a mobilizational resource. One has to ask why. And part of it is doctrine, their version of Marxist doctrine, and part of it is that they'd come to power in a country where most of the people wanted their religion, their customs, their villages, party pluralism, and they didn't get it from the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks couldn't give it to them.
If you ask my opinion, I mean, I think that Rosa Luxemburg's letter to Lenin in 1918 is the best expression the criticism was taken. She said to him, "You are mistaking emergency measures, wartime measures, for permanent ones. You're institutionalizing them. If you do this, what will happen is the following. The country will fall out first under the dictatorship of a party, then under the dictatorship of the Central Committee of that party, and then under the dictatorship of one member of that Central Committee." And Lenin didn't pay any attention.
So why didn't you choose Rosa Luxemburg then?
Because though she was a great writer, what I like about Trotsky is his polymathic element. We could have had a discussion. It would have been silly to do so, of course. We could have had one about him for at least this length of time, interesting one too, without discussing the Russian Revolution.
Yes, indeed.
Maybe the problem that faces me, anyway, in this discussion is the problem of finding a language with which those who are not on the left and have never been part of the left are able to talk to those like you who were on the left. You've chosen Leon Trotsky as your great life, and I had expected you to tell me what a wonderful man he was, how marvellous his ideas were, what a pity it was that he was sent into exile, and the great things he might have done, he might have achieved had he not gone into exile. And somehow you're unable to do that, and you start talking about committees and letters that people wrote to people and about party structures.
Well, I'm sorry if you feel it's been a waste of your time.
No, in no sense, but I can't understand what it is that you admire about this man.
You're a bleeding Tory and always have been.
Well, yes, I am. I am. And
much of what I say, I think, would be certain to be wasted on you.
I am a Tory, Christopher, and I can explain to you why I'm a Tory. I want you to explain to me.
No, I know why you're a Tory. I know why people are Tories. But it doesn't take 45 minutes and it isn't interesting.
Why you were a Trotskyite?
I think we're done, aren't we?
No, by no means.
Well, I've got to be somewhere at one.
He died with an ice pick in his head. I just want you to tell me where you think he is now.
Well, I think he's the only person of the revolutionary generation of the 20th century who hasn't vanished into complete and possibly deserved obscurity as a result of the failure and defeat, which may have been inevitable, as Trotsky was concluding at the end, of the whole enterprise. And that's why I opened as I did, to say why he remains a figure of interest, while the arguments about Kronstadt and so on, which actually you brought up, not I, seem arcane to us.
You've been listening to Great Lives, and our great life has been that of Leon Trotsky, chosen by my guest, Christopher Hitchens, and assisted by our expert witness, Robert Service. To the last two named, at least, thanks.
Great Lives was presented by Matthew Parris and produced in Bristol by Miles Ward.